Commonly, it is the name used for the Second Indochina War that took place between 1954 and 1975. The Vietnam War usually refers to the period of when the United States and other members of the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, also known as SEATO, joined forces with the Republic of South Vietnam to contest communist forces. These forces were comprised of South Vietnamese guerrillas and regular force units, which were generally known as Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army. During the war, the U.S. possessed the largest foreign military presence and, for the most part, directed the war from 1965 to 1968. Because of this, the war is known as the American War in Vietnam today. The fact that images have the power to make an emotional impact created a new obstacle for governmental restrictions on the press. Along with the birth of television technology came the new challenges the government faced in how it controlled or failed to control the press during World War II and the Vietnam War. Each American issue obviously has its own circumstances. However, with the introduction of photography and the television into the war, the government had given themselves the difficult task of attempting to manipulate the dissemination of images. The very first obstacle for censors was the photograph. During the First World War, the government actually completely banned the publication of images of fallen Americans. The government did not allow a single picture of an American casualty to be published throughout the entire duration of the war. Evidently, the United States continued this strict policy for close to 2 years when the United States entered the Second World War. The Office of War Information, or the OWI, was responsible for keeping reports in check from the front in World War II. The OWI actively censored words, images, and film, however, they also depended on a degree of self-censorship. Pictures taken on the battlefront must have been submitted and reviewed by government officials who had the authority to suppress them. Generally, however, newspaper and magazine editors tended to omit graphically brutal pictures, and images of the dead and horribly wounded were placed in special file within the OWI known as the Chamber of Horrors. This file collected those visuals which the government had deemed too inflammatory or harsh for the public to view. In 1943, the government made a major change in its censorship policy. Public opinion polls made it evident that the American population was wary of the war, so officials decided they needed a different way to rally American citizens. Their new strategy was to allow the press to publish images of dead Americans. For the first time in decades, Americans saw images of their dead countrymen on foreign shores. Yet even these images were sterilized for public consumption. The OWI kept strict control over the types of images that were acceptable to publish. They had tried to only approve anonymous pictures of gracefully fallen men. An example of this is the first ever published photograph of an American casualty in 1943's Life magazine. No matter how hard they tried, the government could not stop the flow of images that depicted traumatic battles and gruesome American casualties. American governmental control was also not enough to prevent television reporters from recording the war's disturbing effects on the Vietnamese. Television journalist Maury Safer's account of American troops who set fire to a Vietnamese village with Zippo lighters is an example of an image that would have never found its way out of the OWI's Chamber of Horrors. In Vietnam, reporters were able to acquire information from the government's Joint United States Public Affairs Office, a very loose OWI equivalent, which was also responsible for distributing wartime propaganda. However, while in Vietnam, official ignorance and evasion were present, so there was no formal force of censorship. Also, the lens of a television camera was considered a difficult thing to restrict, especially in Vietnam, where cameras had the habit of recording and showing the war at its very worst. Vietnam became a subject of large-scale news coverage in the United States only after substantial numbers of U.S. combat troops had been committed to the war in the spring of 1965. Prior to that era, the number of American newsmen in Indochina had been fewer than 24 by even as late as 1964. By 1968, at the height of the war, there were about 600 accredited journalists of all nationalities in Vietnam, reporting for U.S. wire services, radio and television networks, and the major newspaper chains and news magazines. The U.S. Military Assistance Command Vietnam, also known as the MACV, made military transportation readily available to newspeople, some of which actually took advantage to this frequently to venture into the field and get their stories firsthand. That close proximity to the battlefield carried obvious risks, More than 60 journalists were actually killed during the war. Many reporters, however, spent most of their time in the South Vietnamese capital, Saigon, and got their stories from the Joint U.S. Public Affairs Office's daily briefings. The overall role of the media in the Vietnam War is a subject of continuing controversy. Some even believe that the media played a large role in the U.S. defeat. It is argued that the media's tendency towards negative reporting helped to undermine support of the war in the United States, while its uncensored coverage provided valuable information to the enemy in Vietnam. However, many experts who have studied the role of the media have concluded that prior to 1968, most of the reporting was actually supportive of the U.S. effort in Vietnam. The increasingly skeptical, pessimistic tone of reporting may have reflected the similar feelings among the American public rather than creating them. Reporting from Vietnam was indeed uncensored. However, during the entire war period, there were only a handful of instances in which the MACV found a journalist guilty of violating military security. In any case, American disillusionment with the war was a product of many causes, of which the media was only one. What most undermined support for the war was simply the level of American casualties. The greater the increase in casualties, the lower the level of public support for the war. Overall government-controlled censorship in the U.S. has witnessed two extremes. Overall oppressive censorship in World War II that was to the point where the American public barely knew enough details about the war, and the uncontrollable censorship that was too lax during the Vietnam War, which caused the public to know almost too much. Soon, the press and the government would eventually clash heads in court. The massive military study entitled United States-Vietnam Relations 1945 to 1967, a study prepared by the Department of Defense, later known as the Pentagon Papers, was supposed to be classified, but when excerpts of the document were leaked to the New York Times in 1971, which published them, all hell broke loose. President Richard Nixon had even threatened to have journalists indicted for treason, and federal prosecutors attempted to block further publication. They actually had reason to do so, as the documents revealed that the U.S. leaders had specifically taken measures to prolong and escalate the unpopular war. In June 1971, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled 6-3 that the New York Times could legally publish the Pentagon Papers. Soon, all of this will lead to common forms of censorship that we see today. Today, the most common forms of censored material include content that displays excessive or graphic violence, contains matters of a mature nature depicting persons in various states of undress, or materials intended to elicit prurient reactions from those viewing, and contains matters which must be kept secret for national security or public safety. Needless to say, anything designed to impede the United States Constitution and its guarantees of free speech may be subject to judicial review. Generally, courts will take a dim view of any form of censorship as it flies directly in the face of the First Amendment. Because of this, the government must usually have a very compelling reason for trying to interfere with this right, whereas, in the past, they have tried to over-censor information. Censorship of this minimal extent can truly be seen as a compromise. However, as media has moved into the digital age, where there are now thousands of choices, these laws have once again come under attack, and the government is hard-pressed to provide a compelling reason that censorship laws should remain in effect for matters such as decency. They are still continuing to try to provide the perfect compromise between oppressed and lax censorships we have seen in the past. Nevertheless, censorship is still a fact of life in America and will continue to be for the foreseeable future.